Good afternoon, everyone. Today is Thursday, May 18th, 2023. I'm Dr. Umonja Smalls, Director of Professional Development for Maryland Department of Health, Developmental Disabilities Administration. We welcome you to today's Rate Review Advisory Group meeting. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few things about the webinar. One, all participants are in listen-only mode. There are two options to hear the webinar, by computer and phone. If you look at the panel interface on your right labeled audio, you can click either computer or phone to switch for the best option for you. We will be recording the webinar and posting this session on the YouTube and DDA website. Today's PowerPoint has also been uploaded as an attachment and is available to you to download in the webinar panel box along with today's agenda. Questions can be typed into the question box or chat box in the webinar panel, and the team will review and respond as appropriate. And now I'd like to introduce Jen McIlvain to begin today's meeting. Good afternoon, Jen.
All right, good afternoon again, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our May Rate Review Advisory Group meeting. We can go to the next slide, please. We can go over today's agenda. We're going to start with approval of the April meeting minutes, status update on some of the April meeting action items. We'll have an update on the general ledger data collection process from Hilltop, and then we'll get into some more discussion of our FY25 rate review priorities. And then, as we always try to do, time permitting, we'll have some open discussion before we close out with next steps. We go to the next slide, please. As a reminder, this advisory group is part of a structure implemented to further MDH's commitment to the development of adequate and sustainable rates that promote the vision and mission of the DDA. The commitment members have made to participate ensures an open and transparent process to review rates. We go to the next slide, please. All right. Members were sent an email with meeting minutes on May 11th. As chair, I will make a motion to approve the minutes. Would a member like to second?
This is Chris Parks. I'll second the motion.
Great. All in favor of approving the minutes?
Aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? All right, then the minutes are approved. Thank you. Why don't we go to the next slide for some policy updates from Robert.
Great, thank you, Jennifer, and good afternoon, everyone. So during the last meeting, when we were given an update on the Employment First subcommittee, we mentioned that an LTSS transition survey went out. And so we've received those results, and the Employment First Provider Subcommittee will be reviewing those results. There were 4 common themes that we saw when looking at those results, one being day hab rates, transportation, job development rates, and simplification of meaningful day waiver definitions. And so the subcommittee will be preparing recommendations that they'll be forwarding along to the state for consideration. I will, and that's it as far as policy updates for today. So I'll turn it back over to you, Jennifer, to talk about the status of the action items from our April meeting.
Great. So I'll go through the items that you can see on the chart. The first action item was the state was going to provide an update on the requested extension to the deadline for feedback on the FY25 data collection tool. And Following the April RREG meeting, a communication was shared to extend the feedback date to April 20th. That feedback was received, reviewed, and incorporated into the final data collection tool that has been shared with providers. The state team was going to follow up with DCAR on some items, and some updates related to that should be shared today. We're going to finalize the general ledger collection tool. That tool has been finalized. We're preparing to distribute it. Hilltop will provide an update on the planned distribution, training, and technical assistance activities later during the meeting. We were also going to review the status of CPI, the discussion that happened at the last meeting around CPI and COLA, and provide some additional details about that analysis. And it's important to note here that CPI is included in the rates in the sense of the inclusion of the BLS wages. The COLA will continue to be reviewed annually, as it has been. And then our next item was to share the updated data collection tool for the FY25 rate review priorities. Those were distributed to our REG members via email on May 11th and to a wider group of DDA providers on May 12th, and again on May 15th through constant contact. Any questions on any of those items?
In regards to this is Karen Lee, in regards to the review of the CPI and the COLA, and the changing of the rate in the BRIC for salary, we're still behind, correct? Because we're using 2021 or 2022 numbers.
Robert, can you speak to that?
Yeah, so I believe in either Chris or Leslie can confirm. At the last meeting, we showed a table of proposed BLS adjustments. I think that was based on 22. Chris, is that correct? Or Leslie?
Yeah, I can speak to that really quick. The latest BLS wages at the time that we pulled the data is May 2021, and then similar to what we've done with the previous wages, we will be applying the inflation factors to bring it forward to 2024 or 2025 for the 25 rates.
This is Laura. Can I ask a question, Leslie?
Sure.
It didn't, based on the last meeting, the discussion was that CPI wasn't really being used. It had been used in the past, but it was the 4% rate increase that was being used, which in light of, that rate increase is to cover obviously an increase across the entirety of the service. And given inflation, particularly last year, being almost double what the rate increase was, it didn't sound like that had been factored in. And I thought that's what you all were going to look at. So, and then when we looked at the materials that were sent in advance of the meeting, it didn't really look like CPI had been used.
Yeah, so and I'll let Robert speak to this a little more, but the state team decision was to continue using COLA. But I don't know, Robert, if you wanted to speak to that a little more.
Yeah, and we're kind of, as you all may be aware, we don't know at this point in time, the FY25 and 26 COLAs will be accelerated and go into effect this year. and we've not seen anything on how the state wants to address that moving forward as far as provider increases are concerned. But we usually look at the CPI in concert. So for example, when we trended the rates forward, we looked at CPI as well as the updating of the BLS wage, which are the factors that go into getting to that fully loaded brick. And so typically what we've done is when for the mandated 4% increases, we've applied that sort of as an annual adjustment until we get to those rebase years. But right now we can do is review that annually moving forward and try to get a sense of how the state wants to handle that as well moving forward in future legislative sessions.
So Robert, I mean, I have a tremendous amount of concern about this decision because it's really, this whole process, it was supposed to be about what's the right rate. That's the commitment that DDA has made for 9 years, which is what's the right rate. And the right rate would look at what the CPI is, and apply it, when you're projecting forward, given how far back you have to look for the BLS wage. The appropriate thing to do would be to apply CPI. And by making the decision to change from applying the CPI to applying the rate increase, which is not a COLA, it is a rate increase. And embedded in that rate increase was an assumption of CPI at 2.1%, but that is not what we have seen. So it is really taking 9 years of saying we're going to be data driven and looking at what the rate should be and sort of backing into a number, because the 4% rate increase is not based on data, is based on a political decision by the General Assembly. And this process was supposed to be data driven with a goal of getting to the correct rate. So I really, really would ask the department to reconsider.
We can take that back for consideration.
I also think it's confusing, and I, certainly not an expert on this, but either we do the COLA or we do the rebase of the dollar amount with the CPI, but it seems like you're doing a hybrid of the two, and so it's confusing to me as a layperson what the methodology is. So I think just another way of saying what Laura said is, the COLA is the COLA, and then the rebase, and then the CPI rebases the whole thing is a separate way. But it seems like you're doing some sort of hybrid between the two. And then you said, Robert, that you were waiting for the rebase years. I think you said is when we relook at the that. When is that, and is that now or is that not now? Because I'm hearing Leslie say that that was a part of the decision that was already implemented in the rates for 2024.
Yeah, there's been no decisions yet on the rebase year. Those conversations are ongoing internally with the department.
And if it's helpful, I can speak to that question around the mix of CPI and COLA. The intent is to bring forward our data to the contract period. So if we're looking at 2018 BLS data, for example, we want to increase that to get to 2019 and then again to get to 2020, et cetera. So for the years that there was not a COLA mandated, we used CPI in its place. And then when the legislature did mandate that COLA, that's where the COLA has replaced those. And so it is a combination of CPI and COLA. It's COLA when there was that adjustment. And if there was no COLA, then we had a CPI increase for the years that there was no COLA. Does that help explain a little bit better?
It does, I guess, though, but you're talking about putting in the new BLS rate, right? So you are adjusting that piece according to it. That's not considered a rebase when you put in that new number?
Yeah, it's a little bit complicated. Usually when we talk about rebase, we talk about, collecting a new data set to start over again. And that is one new data element. So I wouldn't necessarily say that's like a full rebase, but that is like a rebase, that it is collecting new information for that.
I'm sorry, can I just say one more thing? If this model of applying whatever the rate increase is to the BLS, which then drives the whole brick, it could be 0%, it could be 1%, it could be 2%. We have absolutely no idea what the administration will request, put in the budget, and then what the General Assembly will fund. And using that rate increase is not data driven. I guess I wish I could hear if somebody understands that using that number it really diverges from the concept of what should the rate actually be. You are depressing the projection of the BLS. So you're inherently lowering the rate unless somehow the rate increase happens to align with the CPI, which is unlikely.
This is Scott, and I just have to chime in. I agree with you, Laura. That seems pretty self-evident to me that, again, it's two different issues. We want the rate to be what is real and true, and that needs to be driven from the BLS. And if we can't get current BLS rates, then we have to rely on the CPI. So I think you make a really good point. It hadn't hit me until this conversation. Truthfully, these are two different things. And one's political, which we appreciate. We're glad that the political bodies can do something with that, but that's different than looking at the rates.
I would absolutely have to agree. And we're talking about, setting the future for our rates as well. And Laura, it was very, very well stated and explained. I think it makes it much easier to follow because it is a bit complicated. So I appreciate you laying it out that way. Thank you.
So for Chris and Leslie, I guess my question would be, is this, it feels a little arbitrary, like backing into something rather than moving forward with something. So is there a way, is this documented somewhere that this is what we're going to do, that we're going to use the BLS code that's slightly antiquated, or BLS number that's slightly antiquated, and then we're going to use the COLA that was available through our state legislature to update it rather than the CPI equivalent for that year? Is that written somewhere so that we can know that that's going to be the process going forward, or is it uniquely this year, or is it, I'm trying to understand as well, like, I agree with Laura's point that it seems like you're using two different methodologies and putting them together rather than a single methodology And our assumption was that you were using the methodology of the BLS plus the CPI, which doesn't have anything to do with the state of Maryland, right? That's how you get to a current BLS is you take the somewhat antiquated BLS rate and then you add the CPI, and that would be the current, and then the 4% can go on top of that.
So Karen, this is Steve. I'll take that. We have documented where we insert the COLA in the methodology. And as Chris said, we make certain that it represents a particular year's application. And it is a policy decision on behalf of the state. And so I think the idea, and this is consistent with what we've seen in other states, is that it would be difficult for DDA to substitute their judgment in the place of the legislature for an annual increase. What we've said is we think there needs to be an annual increase applied, and we've worked with DDA to do that. And so, I'm going to leave it to MDH or DDA to describe the policy deliberations if they want as part of today's conversation.
Let me just say, I don't think this is in any way saying that the department is disagreeing with or making a different recommendation. This is either a data-driven process or not. Every time we ask for policy consideration, we're told it has to be data-driven, but when we say, why isn't this being data-driven, it's a policy decision by the state. So this is not about disagreeing with a decision of the General Assembly or, the governor of the General Assembly. It's about saying, what is the correct rate? If you don't give the governor and the legislature what the rate should actually be using real data, they can never make the right decision about what the rate increase should be. We are basically setting ourselves up to fail.
So just to make sure, just to make sure I am understanding the feedback. So is what you are all saying that you would recommend trending items like the BLS forward with using CPI, but then only factoring the COLA in when figuring out overall budget adjustments? Because remember, that's always a factor that's in play here as well. So I understand what everyone's trying to say.
It's Chris Parks. I mean, I think what we're doing essentially is mixing two goals. It's what we can fund versus what the rate should be. When we started talking about applying the rate increase into the equation as opposed to, CPI or COLA, the purpose of the process was to eventually define what an appropriate rate should be to fund it. We all understood from day one that the state may not be able to afford that, but the process was there and was set up to define what the appropriate rate should be. My opinion is by commingling the rate increase as opposed to the COLA or in lieu of it, we're losing that trajectory. We're getting away from the ultimate end goal, which is to define what is the appropriate rate. Again, if we can't fund it, that's one thing. That's the political side of the equation that we all knew was there. But we don't want to lose the data and the process and the ultimate end goal of defining what the appropriate rate should be at this time. And I think when we mix the two together like that, or we substitute one for the other in certain cases, because it's not been that way so far, that we're getting off track and we're losing where we were eventually headed, which is to define that rate that should be funded to the providers to provide the service adequately at this point in time. Whether the state can fund it or not is secondary to that in getting that correct number, in my opinion.
All right, well, we will definitely take this feedback back and have some internal discussion. We absolutely always value this feedback, and I think I'm hearing a lot of the same feedback from everyone on this. So we'll definitely have some internal discussion. Meanwhile, I would like to turn it over to Optimus, not Optimus, I'm sorry, to Hilltop, to give us a general ledger data collection template update.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Next slide, please. And then we can go ahead and do next slide as well. Okay. So great news that the general ledger template has been finalized, and all of the documents are set to be distributed by the state to the DDA provider network this afternoon. As we have discussed at RAG meetings over the past few months, the final data collection template is the result of an engaged process that began last October with providers and key stakeholders. We appreciate the efforts of the RAG to review, discuss, and provide iterative feedback. We ask the RAG for their continued support in encouraging your networks and providers to review the tool and instructions quickly to allow enough time to prepare for any necessary system or data collection changes. The ability for providers to submit data for fiscal 24 on the general ledger collection template is integral. The general ledger template will be used annually to collect data to inform the rate review process. Accurate data from a significant number of providers will be needed for a future rate rebase. In order to minimize any confusion over the data collection tool for the current rate priorities and the general ledger template, which will be the new cost data collection tool being implemented for fiscal 24, the timing of communication and technical assistance activities has been carefully considered within the limited time frame to accomplish success with both data collection efforts. The goal is to allow providers to prioritize the quick turnaround to inform fiscal 25 and the current rate review priorities, while also having enough time to review the general ledger cost collection documents to implement any changes to accounting systems for the start of fiscal 24. So for providers to be able to collect data starting July 1st. Both data collection tools are key for the rate review process and informing data-driven decisions. Next slide, please. So we have been talking about technical assistance to support the introduction and implementation of the general ledger collection template. These next steps highlight the upcoming technical assistance opportunities. So as we've noted, the tools will be distributed later this afternoon to the DDA provider network. Training and technical assistance will be available to support providers with understanding the data collection template and implementing any required changes in anticipation for data collection and reporting starting on July 1st. All training and technical assistance activities will be centralized and provided by the Hilltop DDA rate team to ensure consistent messaging, information, and guidance. 3 training sessions will be offered and recorded for those providers who are not able to attend live sessions. Providers can reach out directly to Hilltop for technical assistance questions, to schedule one-on-one meetings, and to request additional technical assistance as needed. Again, providers are encouraged to review the documents prior to the training sessions and are welcome to reach out to Hilltop via the designated email address with questions at any time. We have planned 3 training sessions. The dates are tentative. The hope is to follow the question and answer sessions that will be scheduled for the current priorities data collection tool to allow providers to prioritize being able to get that data back in by June 9th. So the training sessions will tentatively be the 1st and 2nd week in June. And we will share additional communication and registration for those sessions next week, so providers can schedule and sign up. The key dates to remember for the general ledger collection template are that the tool will be distributed this afternoon. The template will be used to collect data for fiscal year 24, so that will be starting July 1st. And the templates will be due in September of 2024, following the end of the fiscal year. We appreciate your continued support to provide the general ledger collection tool promote the general ledger collection tool and encourage your networks and providers to review and engage with technical assistance as needed. Ongoing technical assistance will continue and will be available to all providers throughout fiscal 2024. So those are our key updates for today, and we look forward to sharing the tool this afternoon and working through questions as providers reach out.
Kristen, it's Chris Parks. Just want to thank you for trying to clarify the difference between the two tools. Certainly, I'm sure in the provider community, there's some confusion. This is the long-term data collection tool that we're working on that's going to grab 2024 data that you have here due in September, as opposed to the data collection tool that went out Friday and Monday for the FY25 rate priority piece that is looking at 22 data. Certainly, very similar tools, similar training, similar time frame. I think anything that DDA can do when they distribute this tool is to attempt to differentiate it for providers and let them know that there are still two tools out there right now that we're requesting information that there's training on. It's a little confusing. I mean, obviously a lot going on, a lot of information coming out. Just want to make sure that we're clear that there's definitely two tools and that they are serving two different purposes right now.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. We also appreciate that it's creating some confusion and are trying to be as clear as possible in the communication and trying to stagger it a little bit to make that distinction and prioritize the quick turnaround, but also give enough time to prepare for the long-term goal.
And thank you for doing that. Just one follow-up question. We requested the GL, the long-term tool, the data be due in September of each year. I know we've recommended that the data collection tool be tied out to audited financial statements for providers, and I think in that time frame, that's going to be a pretty quick turnaround from close of fiscal year to audit being done to having valid data to complete this. Can there any consideration be given to moving that September due date back to one that's similar in when the cost reports due? Typically, provider tax returns for a 6/30 are due 11/15. So typically, providers have to have the audit and process done by early to mid-November. With the opportunity, typically, we've done the cost report. The cost report's been due in December. I think a similar time frame and pattern would be helpful. I think pushing it earlier than that. I don't know that there's an advantage for DDA to have it earlier than that, knowing when the rate review group starts again and when session starts. So just ask that the consideration be given to give maybe providers a little bit more time in completing this tool at the end of the fiscal year.
Yeah, Chris, that's great feedback. And we did have some additional internal discussions about this point, knowing that the cost data is typically due much later, allowing more time for that audited financial process. So with the template that's going out in the instructions, it actually will indicate that there doesn't need to be aligned, or you don't have to wait for the audited financials in order to input the data and submit it back. Providers will be required to sign an attestation that will accompany the template. As we get into being able to collect the data and review it, there may be the potential to review that and make changes. But given that this is the first time we're getting data back, and it will probably take a significant time to go through and review, work back with providers about making any changes or clarifying where costs are put, we wanted to allow that extra time in order to be able to have the data ready to go at the start of the calendar year with the rate cycle.
Hi, this is Scott. What are your thoughts on what the attestation that providers will sign? What will they be attesting to? I know this is rough at this point. You've got a year plus, but I just want to get any of your thoughts now.
Yes, and so it looks similar to attestations we use for the MCOs and other data that's collected. Essentially, it's just saying that the data is accurate, to the best of their knowledge, inputted, and aligns with the instructions as best as possible. There will be a copy of that attestation in the instructions that go out. So you'll be able to see what that looks like.
Good, thanks.
Kristen, this is Maria. Is the tool then, is this a draft? We haven't seen, the revised draft since the version that was sent out in March. And I know you mentioned that there were a lot of changes. So is this considered a work in progress? And as you get comments or feedback from the providers through these technical assistance sessions, you'll be making revisions, and how should we think about this tool? Is it is it one and done, or is it going to be changing, and how frequently?
So I think the tool can be considered finalized for fiscal 24. Really wanted to give providers what will be required so that they can make those changes. So the tool as it stands will hold for fiscal 24. As we receive feedback, or providers start using the tool, if there's discussions that are needed before it's set for 25, in order to give providers opportunity to make those changes, that can certainly be discussed and reviewed. I think, as we mentioned in past calls, we had to get to the point where we just had to cut it off and finalize it so that we can get it implemented. But the opportunity for changes in future years can certainly be discussed.
Yeah, my concern is, I think we had a lot of comments and changes and suggestions, and didn't, haven't seen the final. So in thinking about the administrative burden to the providers, we're asking them to have to, complete the fiscal 24 or 25 data collection tool in the next 2 weeks. And then there's this tool with all of the trainings, and, and to the extent there's some learnings to be found from the interim data collection tool that I'm guessing we'll talk about soon, that it would be helpful to have at least incorporated that into this version, rather than having a lot of changes in definitions, or just build on what we learn, as opposed to having to wait and try to remember for next year.
Yeah, so we appreciate that there probably will be a lot of feedback. And we have, as we've been talking about, we've already engaged a group of providers and done several rounds. We've incorporated a lot of the feedback that was sent back, and so we're hopeful that our first attempt at the tool is well vetted, and then we'll certainly continue to take feedback as providers offer it.
And this GL tool is required for all providers to complete? Is that right?
I'll defer to Robert. I don't think it will be mandatory in the way that the cost reports are legislatively mandated, but I think it will be highly desirable for as many providers to submit as possible. I think, as we've been talking about, like a rate rebase really will need to be data driven. And so we will need a significant number of providers to submit accurate data in order to be able to discuss and support that in the future.
Kristen, it's Chris Parks. Two things. I think if the tool is optional, I have significant concerns of whether we're going to get enough sufficient data to do what we need to do with it. And then my second question is the recommendations that the RAG members made, because again, we've not seen that final draft, were the data grabs for hours, so we could attempt to determine any kind of utilization percentage, or at least be able to look at what utilization is actually occurring. Were those incorporated into the final draft?
So I do believe that we incorporated some pieces of that into the final draft. As I think we've mentioned before, it's not a separate, wage, non-wage, for the staff, but it does allow for all of the non-wage time to be added. And I think within the wages, there is the opportunity to add the hours for the wage time.
I mean, I think, to reiterate, I think that's a very critical piece in understanding the health and well-being of the providers, because it's one thing to set the rates, it's one thing to set the policies. It's a whole nother to determine actually what's going to happen in the field when things are occurring. I think without that utilization percentage, it's going to be difficult to really get an accurate beat on what the end result is. I mean, we can think we have the greatest rate in the world, but if providers can't bill, then financially it doesn't work.
Yeah, I'd echo that. I think just having that ability to split out the time by billable and non-billable is critical, and that's, I think, what Max at least attempted to do in the most recent data collection tool. And from what I understand, that component of the data collection isn't being requested in this GL tool, but it's obviously critical to accurate rate setting. So I'll be interested in seeing what the tool is, but I do have some concerns that it will limit the usefulness of the tool, which is not what we want providers to, if providers are going to take the time to complete, this is a lot of time, for providers to collect this data. And so we want to make sure it's useful and used.
Yes, and we certainly appreciate the ongoing feedback. And so as you have an opportunity to look at the revised tool, again, can reach out and share your additional thoughts.
All right. I think it's probably a good opportunity to and refresh everyone's memory from some things that we've talked about over the past year and a half or so. Since I know there was some question about what's rebasing and what isn't. So I think we've kind of approached this process as having what we call review years, which is what this year is, where we're looking at some specific issues and collecting data on those issues and deciding whether we want to adjust the rate based on that data collection versus rebase years, which, as I think Chris said earlier, is kind of taking a completely fresh set of data and looking at all of your assumptions again. And I think where this all really comes together is this general ledger data collection tool, getting it up and running, getting providers used to using it and comfortable using it is going to be really critical to being able to successfully fully rebase the rates in the coming years. So just hopefully that helps everyone see how all of these pieces can fit together.
I think to that point, Jennifer, so this data would be used to inform fiscal 27, is that right? Because we have like a 3-year lag. Is that the right way to think about it? That we're going to have several more cycles of data or ad hoc data requests before this data will be available to inform a full rebase of the rates.
So I think I will put that question to our colleagues from Optimus to feel comfortable from your perspective, to feel comfortable having a rebase year. How many years of data from the general ledger data collection tool do you think you would want? Or hybrid of general ledger data collection and some ad hoc data? Just kind of what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'll jump in here. I know there's been some discussion and there hasn't been any final decision made around that rebase. In the past, I believe we had primarily 1 year of general ledger data. And so, that's certainly seems like a reasonable possibility, but we can talk about, some pros and cons there. I know everyone is interested in getting updated data as soon as possible, so that we can, be more in line with current trends and current information. So, we're interested in having a rebase sooner rather than later as well. So I don't know if we necessarily have a specific timeline for rebase, but that seems like that's roughly, a good approximation of what we would expect, is that we would have probably a couple more years of ad hoc while we get this information for a full year, and then have a little bit of time to review that, adjust that, and have discussions there.
I mean, and as we move
CMS
forward in
requires,
this,
I was just going to
Oh,
say,
go ahead.
CMS requires rebasing every 5 years, and I thought there was a commitment by DDA to rebase every 3 years, at least at one point there was. I guess, yeah, I guess my point is, I'm a little worried just given that the rates right now are based on 2014 GL data. So it's been a long time. And so, to the extent I understand we're trying our best to collect this data, but it feels like we're at the beginning of a long process, a long data collection process, as opposed to, a lot further along. So, hopefully this tool will also be used to collect historical data or be used to inform the rate setting to get us to accurate rates and assumptions, because it's just been 2014 data is just, to me, quite old to rely on.
Well, and to add to Maria's point, I mean, this is really going to be the first time that we're grabbing data on the new services. 2014 operations did not look like they didn't do right now. Services do not look like they do right now. Everything's based on assumptions. I mean, some logical assumptions, but still assumptions at this point in time. So looking forward to seeing the actual data on new services and how providers have been able to adapt to the changes.
Which is exactly why, this is Steve, we want to lock the GL template down so that we can begin this process as soon as possible.
Yeah, I think we're all on the same page at thinking rebasing sooner rather than later would be good. We just have to determine when we have the data that will allow us to do that. So with that, I think we're going to move in to our discussion of the latest on the FY25 rate review priorities. So I will turn it over to Optimus.
Thanks, Jennifer. So we can move to the next slide, and I think potentially the one after that as well, where we have the grid. Yep. And just to keep things rolling along, after this, I'd like to be able to screen share for a minute or a couple of minutes so that I can walk through the data collection tool. But in the meantime, on this slide, we're just coming back to this grid that we've shared a few times. This is kind of an updated iteration of those rate priorities. The data source column has been updated to reflect where we intend to gather information from. So last Friday, that finalized fiscal year 25 DCT was shared, and the priorities highlighted in gray are potential data we're looking to collect from the DCT. So we're looking, you can see there, for facility and program support information, also the distribution of transportation costs between different services, non-billable time, looking to split that out and get an idea of what's going on there, requesting information around that structure change, as well as some updated information that can be used in the training assumption. And so that's around, turnover rates and level of training that's currently in place. So that would be updated with the new training hours assumptions. but that would use if we have, for example, a higher turnover rate or, more part-time versus full-time, those kinds of things. We'd look at, applying the new hours expectations with in conjunction with that kind of turnover and staffing level. So that's the intent of how we're looking to collect information here and be able to review those different pieces. So now we wanted to be able to take a few minutes to discuss the fiscal year 25 data collection tool. We'll share the tool and do a very brief overview and walkthrough. So this is, thank you. I'm going to see if I can share my screen here. Okay. Hopefully, are you able to see that Excel document with some instructions there? Cool, I'm getting some thumbs up, so that looks good. So this is the tool that was shared. I'm just going to do a quick walkthrough. There's information out in how it was shared as well, but just to give everyone a little bit of context to make sure we're kind of on the same page. We do have an instructions tab, which
increase the percentage a little bit, please, down in the lower right-hand corner.
Sure. So we do have that instructions tab, which walks through some of the details of how to populate each of these tabs and describes what's present there, what we're aiming to collect, and what specific cells, kind of colors are built in so that we know, what needs to be populated and what would be automatically calculated. We do have some options there for, open comments as well. So in addition to providing any sort of information, we are asking for any, context or additional comments that we can collect. On the second tab, we have a request for provider information, and this is just to, help organize the information a little bit better here, where we're just asking some basic things: organization name, Medicaid number, provider number, and the person completing the template, so that we can kind of keep track of things and make sure that we're organizing that consistently. So moving on to the data collection pieces, this first tab that we have here, tab 1, program support and facility. This is pretty similar to what we had shared in the past. We have added some notes here that describe what each of these pieces mean. There are also directions on an additional tab that help to explain, what's covered by each of these categories, as well as some additional details down here that explain when we're looking for geographic differentials, these are the counties that we're looking for, and some areas for comments. So just to kind of recap what we have here, we're looking for information that splits out the day habilitation services by size. We're looking at those components that we talked about, so wages, program support, and facility costs. And we have that split out. We're requesting that by, non-billable wage versus billable wage, and what sort of wage costs and non-wage costs. So this is something that we have at kind of a high level, that we've heard some feedback in the past that there's difficulty parsing things out. So that's why we have this at a very high level, and we're asking, similar to last cycle when we asked about some of those various components, that providers populate as much as they can to the best of their ability. So we understand if it's difficult to split geographic differential from rest of state, or if it's difficult to split out the DAHAB different group sizes. So we're asking providers to populate as much as they can in kind of a summary level here. We'll get to another tab in a second that asks for very similar information with a bit more detail. That was based on feedback we heard from the RAG. So I'm just going to go to the next tab, so we're kind of keeping in order here. And this one is a training and turnover tab. So what we're looking for is the employees that needed kind of initial training. So when they first come in, I don't remember off the top of my head, but it's something like 70 or 80 hours of specific trainings that are required. And so we're trying to say, how many people needed that. For example, if you had somebody start and they were only there for 3 months, and then you had to replace them and you had to do training all over again, that's where we want to get all that information. We're looking at how many people needed all of that initial training. We also want to look at how many employees needed that ongoing training. So they were they may have been done initial training in the past, and during this time period, they had ongoing training where they need to keep things up to date every 2 years or 3 years, so that we can get a good idea of those hours. And then those are kind of a numerator there of that we apply the number of employees. We'd look at the number of hours worked by employees who required that DDA training. So we get the total hours of training that we're getting from DDA with those updating training guidelines. We'd apply that, basically multiplying that by the number of people who needed training for each of those periods, and divide that out by the number of hours worked, so that we can get that training percentage. We also put in here a provider calculated turnover. So we understand that there are sometimes inconsistencies in how things may be done between providers. So we're looking to collect turnover information to make sure that we are getting a good representative sample here. Same idea that we're asking about those employees needing initial training. You know, if that's turnover rate is you're replacing the same position 3 times in a year, we want to make sure that we're capturing that appropriately. We also have a text box here to provide any comments on the turnover percentage. I'm going to walk through a couple more tabs, and I'll pause for questions, and we can come back to any of these in particular. This one is a structural change tab. It's in red. And so this is something that we had talked about in the past, where there could be alternative structures proposed. So right now there's 2-to-1, 1-to-1, small group, and large group. We've talked about issues with trying to split it up into individual group sizes. So having one rate for 3 people, and one rate for 4 people, and one rate for 5 people. We've talked about that there may be differences in how providers are able to serve these individuals, but we haven't gotten any feedback on what the appropriate change, or what change that would kind of be universally agreed upon, or make sense to move to. So what we're looking for is, can we get any information around providers saying, you know what, the small group, what we end up doing is we only have 2 to 3 people. That's really how it works in real life, that kind of thing, so that we can understand if there is a good reason for change, and what kind of change that should be. So this is really just kind of getting that informational piece there about what structural changes should be considered, if any. So we'll move on to this last tab here of data collection. And this is a piece that we got from Max as part of the RAG feedback. So this is going to collect similar information to what was collected on that tab 1 of program support and facility. It does ask for additional detail. So you can see, for example, here we have base wage, overtime, bonuses, contract, other, things like that. There's also some different ways that it's collected, where we're looking at hours versus total dollars, that kind of thing. And so this, we asked for feedback on how providers would be able to collect this information, and how they may, easily share this information. This was some feedback that we received from the RAG, and so we have incorporated that here. And what we heard about this is that this is more in line with how some of the data have been collected by providers in the past. So it may be easier to populate this information. And so there's additional information here. There's those total hours worked. And this is going to help us understand some of that information around, billable and non-billable time. We also have information that's down here that asks about these various components. So transportation, program support, training, et cetera. And I think we have all of them down here: general administrative costs, facility costs, other costs. So this is a lot more detail. This is something that, if we're able to collect all this, that's fantastic. We understand that some of this may be difficult for providers to give some of this detail, and we're also hearing feedback that this may be simpler for providers to give. So what we're asking providers to do is to populate at a minimum this kind of summary level data, the program support and facility tab, and if possible, we would prefer that they also populate this proposed template that was recommended by the RAG feedback. So we have that kind of additional look there, and we also expect that, in theory, if they are able to populate both of those tabs, we can use them to kind of cross-reference each other and validate our data a little bit more. I'm just going to run through the last tabs really quick, and then I'll pause again, like I said, for feedback. The next tab here is an example, so providers can see what it might look like if they were to populate this and what kind of information is requested there. We also have a tab that's just open for comments, so any additional context or information providers would like to share or think that we should consider, we'd like to request that. And finally, we have this cost categories defined section, and this is consistent with the general ledger tool, and this goes through in detail for each category what sorts of costs should be included or excluded from that section. And so this will help provide some guidance in how these tabs can be populated in a way that's consistent with other information that we'll request in the future, and that we're kind of putting everything on a similar basis there. So I know I kind of walked through all of those. There's a lot of information there. Some of this we had shared in the past, and this was something that was sent out by DDA on Friday. So hopefully everyone's had a little bit of time to take a quick look at it. But we wanted to pause there and see if there's any sorts of questions or comments there.
Chris, this is Karen Adams-Gilchrist. Perhaps in the instructions where it says if the max tabs are too granular for your organization to populate, perhaps those instructions could be changed, or since you stated that it would be extremely helpful to receive that information at that level, that would be extremely helpful. Perhaps that instruction could be changed so that providers don't overlook that and just do the program support and facility and the training and turnover. If you believe that data will be helpful, perhaps encourage providers to complete that data.
Yep. So that's some great feedback, and we did. This already has been shared, so I don't think we're planning on making any adjustments at this time, but we did try to put that in a couple spots here where we're saying please populate as many tabs as possible and appropriate, and more information will help better inform any potential rate adjustments. We are also planning to have sessions or be able to respond to any sort of feedback. So if providers have those kind of questions, we're happy to provide that guidance as well.
Well, and maybe we could reiterate it during the trainings or the webinars that's going to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great feedback. Thanks.
Hey, Chris, on the training turnover tab, is that just designated just for employee DSPs who work in the with rehabilitation, or are we looking for metrics for all DSPs on the board?
I think at this time we're looking for just rehabilitation, but I think that is something that we'd probably want to look at in a broader picture at a later time.
Yeah, absolutely. Since a lot of staff share different programs too, I think that would be helpful to consider.
We probably want to make sure that's really part of the training instruction as well. Otherwise, you could get the mix.
So center-based rehabilitation is the only group of people who will fill this out.
Yeah, that's the intent, is that we're looking specifically for rehabilitation on this template. We understand that there are, like we're hearing right now, and what we've heard in the past is that it's not always that cut and dry with how things work operationally. That one staff may provide some rehabilitation and also a different type of service, and that there may be shared resources between these. So we're asking providers to do kind of to the best of their ability what's represented by rehabilitation.
This is
Chris,
Scott
just to
on the training
clarify,
tab. Well,
go
on the
ahead, Scott.
training tab, you're not asking for the number of hours that person was in training. That struck me as odd until I was assuming, but you really don't want to know how many hours of training they had.
Sure. So that's a good question. The intent there is that we're really kind of looking at the number of individuals, the training hours that's being multiplied, or the training that we're applying for each of those would be based on that updated training matrix and training requirements that's in process by DDA. And so I believe, I think that was somewhere in the range of 70 or 80 hours, and it looked like that's getting bumped up. I'm not sure exactly, that's still kind of being discussed, but if that's getting bumped up to 90 hours, for example, then we'd be putting that 90 hours, again, as an example, in for each of those employees that need that initial training. And then if they need, let's say 4 or 5 hours every other year, we'd be putting that in for the ongoing training by number of employees.
So I see that now. It does seem to, it doesn't get into the reality of the training, but I see what you're saying.
Chris, it's Chris. Just to clarify your response to Ms. Karen's question, I think she was asking center-based or all day hab providers should be looking to fill this tool out.
I think
Okay,
our
correct
intent
me if I'm wrong, Karen.
No, rehabilitation is a center-based services, so it wouldn't be CDS, it wouldn't be employment services, it wouldn't be if people are using, so it's only the licensed. Where the center is owned and operated by the provider.
But I think what we'd want to make sure is the providers who are licensed for the center-based services that are also providing those supports in the community, they're still filling that out as well. Or you have a hybrid of where your supports are provided.
Somebody from DDA or Optimus is, so are we on, this is licensed rehabilitation centers.
so
Question.
perhaps, go ahead. Okay, perhaps DDA can speak in more detail to this, but I think our intent is to capture any costs that are that cover dehabilitation. So anyone providing these services, any costs that are applicable to these services, that's the intent. I know that's kind of a broad statement there, and I'm not sure if DDA has any more specifics they'd like to share, but that's the intent behind here, is to get a representation of dehabilitation costs.
Yeah, that's correct, Chris.
So I just want to take a moment here and say, we appreciate the feedback. We did ask for some support, and we did get some feedback. We were able to incorporate that, and we really appreciate that. That's how we can move forward collaboratively. And we really appreciate any providers that can spend some time and be able to share some information with us. We understand this is a big ask, and it really does help the process out. All of this will be, aggregated to look together and see, if anything that's in the rates is kind of missing the mark here. We want to be able to identify that and appropriately address it. So really appreciate all the support that we get on this. Any help that we can get, any information we can get is very, very helpful.
I'd like
So,
to,
go ahead.
I'd like to ask for a piece of data from DDA. Robert, if this could be sent out afterwards, is using LTSS and PCIS2, you ought to be able to punch a button and find out how many people are actually receiving day habilitation services, as well as how many people are receiving employment services and how many people are receiving CDS. So your 3 meaningful day services, how many are in each of those services? I think that would be important data for the RREG to know, because this data is looking at a subset of people in meaningful day services. It's not looking at all 3 services. It's only looking at one service within that paradigm of meaningful day services. So if we could have the numbers on that, I'd really appreciate that.
So Karen, just so I'm clear, you want the aggregate number, right, for DayHab,
Yeah.
DDS,
and employment services.
employment.
And my guess is that it shows up in your May and October data that you get. And it would be interesting to see if that data from the Massachusetts, the ICI data is consistent with what PCIS2 and LTSS are saying.
Yeah, we can include that in the email that will accompany the tool when we send it out after this meeting.
Karen's point, this is Steve, gets at something that's really important that we had discussed previously, and I just want to emphasize that we're using this to get very specifically at those DayHab services, not the other things, because that was identified as the rate priority. So it is really important for us, the rate priority for fiscal year 25, to get a significant number of responses so that we have a reasonable amount of data upon which to base any adjustments. And we'll bring that analysis forward and show it to you all, but we want to emphasize how important it is that people participate in this process, because this was the rate priority that was identified by the advisory group. And so this is the data collection associated with it. And we're unable to make changes for those rate priorities if we don't get sufficient responses.
Chris, I saw in the notes that the training dates the question dates haven't been scheduled. Is that accurate?
I believe that's the case. I think there are some dates that are kind of getting worked through, but I'm not sure if anyone else from DDA or from the Optimus team can speak to that.
Yes, so these Q&A sessions are going to be joint sessions between Optimus, Hilltop, and representatives of Max. So we got schedules and availability back earlier this week, and I suspect we'll be sending a save the date flyer out by the end of day tomorrow.
Thank you.
Hey, Steve, Chris Parks, a quick question for you. You said sufficient number of responses. I mean, do you have a benchmark in your head of where that, and again, plus or minus a point I'm not worried about, but I mean, you know, 25%, 50%, where is that magic threshold? I don't want to be in a position where we get, you know, 35% responses, we needed 40 and nothing happens with the data.
Right. The challenge that we have is it depends upon the accuracy of the information that's provided, how consistent it is, and the number of members being served. So unfortunately, I can't give you a fixed percentage. It is just something that we have to go back and look at. For instance, when Caleb was walking people through the transportation components, he talked about the different factors that we have to look at when we decide how much credibility to place on the data that we have. So, sorry, I can't give you a better answer.
Can we at least, if we're going to look and establish a number of individuals being served in DayHab, can we also get the number of providers that are providing DayHab?
Sure, I think we'll, if we can, Chris, get some feedback directly from you after the advisory group meeting as to what level of information you'd like us to report on relative to who provided data, we can definitely provide that.
Thank you.
I know we have some more ground to cover, so I just want to make sure we kind of keep moving forward here. I can turn off my screen share, and then if someone else, whoever was presenting before, wants to take that back up, we can keep working through some of these slides here. So if we move to the next slide, we are just talking through some of the details, again, for the data collection template. So I think it's the one after this, and just again recapping some of the important notes. We are requesting this information by Friday, June 9th. So we are planning to schedule some question and answer sessions during the week of May 21st and May 29th for the DCT to provide any necessary technical assistance. And then, please submit the completed DCT to the RAG inbox. And there are those 4 tabs that we walked through to be filled out: that program support facility, training turnover, service structure, group size feedback, and that max proposed data collection tool. Like we identified there, we had those specific topics that we're looking to cover, those kind of grayed out cells. And so that's really what we're looking for here. There may be other pieces of information that are present in some of those tools, but we're really looking to just respond to the information that we're asking about or that we're aiming for here. So I think that's kind of where we are on the data collection tool. And if there's no other questions, then I'll turn it over to Leslie and we can walk through some of the additional components.
Chris, it's Chris. I just have one last question. The long-term general data collection tool, general ledger data collection tool, we've got a single contact for providers to ask questions, and thank you for doing that. Is it possible to also have that for this particular tool as well? I know where we're submitting it to, but if a provider has a question, do you want to call in 4 different regional offices, or can we have a single point of contact again, please?
This is Leslie. I was actually just going to say, I think any questions that providers have can also be submitted to this email here, and then we'll make sure that it gets to the appropriate person. I think if DDA is comfortable with this, just let this email on the slide be the point of contact for any questions or submissions of the general ledger, or I apologize, of the data collection tool.
Yeah, absolutely. That's actually the preferred method. Use this email address, send us your questions, and we'll get it routed to the correct person. It also helps us with tracking to ensure that the feedback loop gets closed.
Are there any other questions on the data collection tool before we move on? Great. And we know that today was like very quick run through, but as Chris had mentioned, we plan on scheduling question sessions so we can go into the more details around the instructions and any other questions that providers can have. So definitely lots of opportunities to ask questions between now and the submission deadline. Can we go to the next slide, please? So this table is here again, but just emphasizing that last time we talked through some of the priorities that we were able to review in the meantime that we were finalizing the DCT. So namely the base wages, there are some training components that we're looking at, and then the service adjustment assumption. So for training, we've received a draft of the latest training matrix from DDA. It's still being finalized, but we're already working on interpreting how it will impact the rates. We don't have any updates on that part of the training yet. And then in the DCT, as you saw, we were asking for turnover data, so we will need to see what information comes back to that for us. And then last time we did talk through some initial results on the BLS and the service adjustments. And so after discussing with the state the possible options, some of the decisions were made. So we just wanted to give you an update on that decision-making process for that. Next slide, please. So the slide should look familiar because it was shared last time, but we did a comparison of the fiscal year 24's rates, which is the 2018 BLS data, and then inflated to fiscal year 24 using the inflation factors we've been using in the past. And then the 2021 BLS data, which is the latest that we had at the time, and then inflating to fiscal year 24 so we can compare it to an apples to apples basis. So this is not intended to say that this will be the final BLS rate in, because we still need to take into consideration the inflation factor for fiscal year 25, but we wanted to make a full comparison to on a same fiscal year basis. And we saw last time that the average rest of state wage is 3% higher, and the geographic differential rate is showing 6% higher for the updated BLS data, except for large group where we were seeing about a 5% drop. So this is what we shared last time. And so if we go to the next slide, after internal discussions, DDA made the decision to update the base wage to May of 2021 as the base for day habilitation services, except for that large group in the geographic differential rate, which would have resulted in a decrease to those rates. So just accounting for the BLS wage change in the rates, this results in approximately 8% increase to the rest of state rate, and then 11% increase to the geographic differential rate, except for that large group, which stays consistent with last year's rate. So a couple things to keep in mind. The percentage increase shared is a comparison of the fully funded rates, and there's no other changes to the rates that were taken into account, because we just wanted to isolate what this one update would do to those day habilitation rates. Any questions? Okay, and then we had already talked about this at the beginning, but there was a question last time about visiting inflation factors. And then after internal discussions, at the moment, DDA is choosing to continue to use the current or the factors we've been using for the last several years.
So Leslie, this is Maria. I have two questions. One, I think we talked last time around what those factors are. So in the previous slide, you said you took the historical BLS, the May 2018, and projected that forward to fiscal 24 versus the May 21 projected to fiscal 24. Do you have what those factors are that take you from 18 to 21 and then 21 to 24? I think you said you would follow up on that. And
so the 18 projected to 24 is what was built into the rate model last year. We didn't make any changes to that, but that has the mix of CPI and COLA increases that have been pushed through. And then for the 2021 BLS wages projected to 24, we used the exact same factors because we, again, wanted to make an apples to apples comparison without changes there.
Right. So which years were CPI and which years were COLA, I guess?
I don't recall off the top of my head, but I believe that it's in the rate model. I can make a note to follow up with you on that, and I apologize that we missed that information.
Yeah, I didn't see it in the rate model. I just see one number, so that's why I was trying to unpack the different trend components, because I know you have a different trend every year. I'd like to understand that.
Yes, we can take that back with the state and make sure that that information gets relayed.
Okay. And then I guess the other question that I had is the 8% and the 11%. So how do you get, if the BLS is underestimated right now at 3%, how are you getting to 8% and 11%? Is this just the BLS, or this includes other components? Like, I know you're like other things that are going into the rate increase.
Yeah, so we're not speaking to the final rate increase. What we did was we took the fully funded rate from fiscal year 24, updated the BLS wage that goes into the, impacting all of the other components without any other changes, and compared the final rate. And so this is what we ended up with because of all the compounding factors.
And you said 0% is going to be for geodifferential large group. So
just for the wage impact, that's correct. The other components that we're looking at based on the data collection hasn't been determined yet, but we're just comparing wage, the final rates with a wage difference. That is accurate.
thank you.
Quick thing before we go off this slide, just to tie back to the very first conversation. This is an example of where the methodology that's currently used has been a hybrid because, for instance, the the BLS wage would actually result in a decrease, and the state made a policy decision not to pass that through. And so we understand your feedback about the CPI versus the COLA, but this is an example of where it has been a hybrid methodology in the past. We are not just passing directly through the results of rate changes purely from just data.
This is Scott, and I just want to make a comment. It's not a recommendation, but just a comment again on the impact of the geographic differential. And just as a reminder, in PCIS, the difference in the geographic differential is 7%. Current rates in LTS are about 13%, meaning people in the geographic differential now getting 13% more per unit of service compared to 7%. And now there's going to be another shift there. I just think as a community, we need to keep an eye on that because it does have an impact on, especially providers adjacent to those jurisdictions. We're all competing for the same pool of DSPs, and I don't have a recommendation. I just think it's something we need to be cognizant of that does have an impact. Thank you.
Scott, thank you for the feedback. We appreciate that. We understand bright line theory applies anytime you do a differentiation. So we will keep an eye on that.
Can I just say, I think I agree with Scott, and I do worry about it. And I think at some point it might be worth a policy discussion about what's an acceptable range for the two categories of rates, and whether that gets capped in some way, some methodology.
Laura, that's good feedback. And again, that kind of thinking is consistent with the hybrid methodology, where we don't necessarily always completely pass through all of the results based on the data. So we appreciate it.
I just want to weigh in on that as well. This is Greg from PEDMAR. The value, the importance of looking at it on an ongoing basis, because if you're, and it hits close to home for us. I mean, Northern Baltimore County is is not the same as the rest of the state. And you're either one or the other the way it's currently set up. And so I think these things can get a little bit out of hand. It's great, you know, and there are certain realities to the differentials based on where people are located. But to grow, if you look at the map of how the rest of the state is lumped together, it is not like it's comparable across everybody that's considered the rest of the state. So I think a policy conversation around that as we look forward is also just reiterating what the others have said. Not looking to take money away from you folks down there, you know, that are competing with in DC in those areas, but I kind of just, you know, shake my head at how we've come up with what we've come up with. So if y'all come up to Moncton, I'll show you exactly what I'm talking about.
Right. And remembering that DC's minimum wage goes up to $17 an hour. And as contractors, we have to pay $22 an hour. So DC, you know, I can see DC from my office, right? I could see it's 8 blocks away from here. And yeah, so.
Hey, you're starting to sound like Sarah Palin. Enough's enough.
Got a little accent going on there. Yeah. Yeah, I definitely, so we do live it as well because our neighbors are Washington, D.C.
No question.
You know, and Virginia that pays $85 an hour for their voc rehab. And yeah, definitely.
This is Steve. We think this is a very good conversation. We appreciate the ongoing dialogue, and we'll constantly be reviewing that and presenting information to MDH and DDA about the geographic differential and the advisory group.
Are there any other comments around the base wage analysis? I appreciate all the initial feedback that we've been getting.
Leslie, Chris, I just have one quick question. Maria had requested the factoring from 18 to 24. Are we able to get that prior to the next meeting?
We have the information readily available, but I don't want to make the call for if DDA and the state are comfortable sharing the numbers. However, that's a state decision. I don't know if Robert or somebody from the state would like to weigh in on that.
My apologies, Chris, I missed your question.
Maria had requested that we get the factoring for the BLS, the CPI COLA from 18 to 24. I think it was something we were looking for from the last meeting as well, too. Are we able to get it before the next meeting so we can take a look at it? That was all.
Sure, we can take that into consideration.
Robert. That's where I'm going to vote for him.
Okay, if there aren't any other comments or questions, then we can move on to slide 18, please. One more slide. Thank you. So this table here should also look familiar. We're just going to update you on the decision for the service adjustment assumption. If you recall, the last time we talked through how we pulled data from Maryland state closures, which is defined as liberal leave or closure in effect for any county. The current adjustment in the rate model is 3.6%. We calculated the total number of closures over the last 3 years, which totaled 32, and divided by the assumed number of work days, which is estimated to be about 240 days a year. And that's how we would calculate the service adjustment. In the past, we used 2014, 15, and 16 data, I believe. to get a 3.6%. Those numbers were slightly varying from what we have on the table here, so you won't be able to back into that 3.6%, but that was the calculation that we used. And so next slide, please. DDA has decided to use the most 3 recent years of closure data to update that assumption. So that 4.4% increase will be passed through to the day habilitation rates, which accounts for approximately 8.8% increase to all of the day habilitation rates. So again, we just wanted to isolate the impact of this specific adjustment. And so that 0.8% increase is just the impact of updating the service adjustment calculation and no other changes to the day habilitation rates.
Leslie, it's Chris. Just want to share a thought. I think the smaller that the window that we're looking to grab, whether 3 years, 7 years, 6 years, whatever it might be, I think we open ourselves up for the anomalies like last year or this current past winter with no snow. My recommendation actually be have a larger window that's still reasonable and maybe drop the high and the low out so you can get a good solid average. And then the years that are 25 closure days or 0 closure days don't necessarily have the significant impact that they could on a 3-year window basis.
Yeah, and we did have that conversation internally, but when looking at the data, if we go back to the last table, looking at the data on that table, there were some outliers in the prior years to that, big event in our lives that impacted a lot of service interruptions and also just anomalies that occurred. And so the decision for now is to take the latest 3 years, but maybe in future years we can take a larger average or make those kinds of considerations. So that's very valid feedback that we appreciate and will take into consideration.
Leslie, I have a question. It's not specific to the service adjustment analysis, but the last number of slides we've talked about, I guess, the wages and the service adjustment and what that would mean for the rates specifically for those items, not factoring in the data collection tool data, obviously, because we don't have it yet. But is there is there an overall rate increase for DayHab based on just these items? I know we have them broken out.
So we can approximate what that difference is just taking these 2 percentages together, but we didn't want to target any kind of percentage or look at the overall rate until we incorporate all of the changes at once and see what is the overall impact to the rates. And so that's why this time we had just chosen to isolate what the changes will do to the rates. Okay. We know that based on the data collection efforts that is ongoing right now, there will potentially be some additional changes to the rates. And so we want to look at, what the overall impact will be once all of those changes are applied.
Okay, thank you.
Leslie, this is Maria. I guess back to the BLS wage, the 8%, the 11% is driven based on the BLS kind of being understated, the 2018 trended compared to the 21. And are you proposing to just update the BLS for day habilitation because that particular BLS category is used in a number of different rates as the basis? And so are you just proposing to use it in the DayHab or are other rates being considered as well for a more appropriate BLS base?
So my understanding is that all of the efforts that we've been doing this cycle is for day habilitation. However, I think that is a state decision. So I will let Robert or somebody else from the state speak on that.
My apologies. I'm having some issues with my speakers kind of cutting in and out. Maria, can you repeat that again?
Sure. So just recognizing, Robert, that the BLS wage that's selected for day hab and that's understated. So we appreciate DDA increasing the day hab rates, but that base wage is also used in a number of other rates, like CDS and employment. And so, to the extent you're using that same BLS category for other rates, is there an intention to also use the same starting point rate as you're using for day, or is it just for day?
Yeah, it's a good question, Maria, and we've actually been having those discussions internally. Nothing yet to share here as far as decisions regarding the expansion of those rates beyond services beyond day hab. Our focus has primarily been day hab since it was identified as one of the rate priorities for FY25. But so we continue to have those discussions, and if things change, we'll definitely share that with the team.
So I'd like to voice my concern. It was my understanding that DDA wants to incentivize people living real lives in the community and not being isolated and segregated. And so I would have great concern if we are applying it only to a service that DDA that separates people. And so I just want to put my 2 cents in for that, Robert, as something that it's really critical to look across all services. I did a quick ad on DDA's website. It looks something like 40% of people use day hab as their meaningful day service, and 60% are using other services, which is consistent with the rest of the country. So to do this for 40% of the people receiving supports and is, and I know there's a lot of other factors that go into it, but in terms of the BLS code, and then everybody else gets left behind, and we have to play catch up and continually are playing catch up in the other rates if we don't do it to all rates.
Yeah, I'm sorry, can I just jump in and say, I mean, I would assume that the BLS is going to be updated across the board. It seems like annually that would need to happen. I thought this discussion was really about trying to identify, given that all the other rates services resulted in an increase when providers went into LTSS with the new rates, and day hab was the only service to have a decrease in funding, that hence the focus on this, but that we aren't taking our ball off of our eye off the ball of looking at the other rates as well as we move forward.
Probably goes without saying, but I concur with what Karen and others are saying.
I think if there aren't any other comments, or if, I don't know, Robert, if you had any other things to add to that, otherwise we can move on to the next slide. Okay, that's all the updates we had from our end, but we appreciate all the additional feedback and just comments. Gives us a lot to chew on internally. And so I will pass it back over to DDA, but thank you again for the time and thought that you've put into your feedback.
Great, thank you, Leslie, and thank all of you for your feedback, and your comments and suggestions are noted, and I can assure you we're not taking our eye off the ball when it comes to all of the other rates. We had a very specific goal for the FY25 cycle, and that was to focus on day have as well as employment services. And so, the intention is to ensure there's no, number one, sort of compression going on within that meaningful day category that runs counter to DDA policy and or what we're trying to achieve with those services. And we're definitely not taking our eye off the other rates when it comes to making sure that we're continuing to address any issues around rate adequacy, et cetera. Next slide. Okay, so I'm going to turn it back over to you, Jennifer, to talk about next steps and adjournment.
All right, thank you, Robert. And thanks again to everyone for all of your feedback. We have notes on action items for next time and sooner than next time, so we will be in touch throughout the course of the month until our next meeting. We look forward to our next meeting on Thursday, June 22nd from 12:30 to 2:30 p.m. Members of the public who would like to observe the meetings can register through the DDA training calendar at Constant Contact Events. Register once and get reminders for each meeting via GoToMeeting. Meeting connection links will be sent 1 day and 1 hour prior to the meeting. Meeting minutes will be made available following the meeting. If you have any questions regarding registration or would like to request accommodations, please contact Dr. Smalls. And we go to the next slide. Great. Here we have our remaining meeting dates for this rate review cycle in June, July, and August. And can we go to the next slide, please? All meeting materials will be made available through the designated DDA webpage for the advisory group. And next slide, please. Thank you again for attending and all of this discussion and feedback. And we look forward to continuing the discussion on June 22nd. Thank you.